Yeah. Hi, Breece.
Hello, Alex. How are you?
I'm fine. What about you?
I'm doing great. It's morning here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the United States. Have my coffee.
Yeah. To be honest, because I'm here in Germany, I had my coffee and I drink tea, my dear. Mm.
Yes, happy hour time for you.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's really a pleasure to have you here for our coffee tea discussion today on geotransparency, GIS, monitoring transparency. Um, I will start with a little bit of an introduction of you. So, um, yeah, welcome, Breeze. I'm the host, Alexander Watson from Open Forest. I found a quote in the Directions magazine, so I think it was like 5 years ago, where you described how you got into GIS and conservation space. So I will read it. Um, I fell in love with a new career, and it let me engage with a few things that I have a passion for. Maps, communities working together to save or preserve what they love about their communities and the public lands. You describe yourself on your LinkedIn profile with the following, I would say tags. You speak about resilience, nature-based solutions, environmental justice and conservation, geospatial technology, and geodesign. So you have many roles, just to name a few. You work for the Trust for Public Land, the Lincoln Institute. You're a member of the National Park System Advisory Board, member of National Board of Directors, and National Recreation and Parks, member of the National Geospatial Advisory Committee of the U.S. Department of Interior. You're coordinating committee member network for the landscape conservation, and you're also a book author with a book named Protecting the Places We Love.
Yes.
So having said that all, where would you describe the red line that connects this all?
I think it's really about using technology to tell stories, visualize things, and then help communities use data and use technology to envision the place that they want to live and to make that happen.
Yeah, cool. And can you tell me a little bit how you got into that space? Was it straightforward? So how you
It
ended up?
was not straightforward, actually. It was kind of a windy road. I got my undergrad degree in exercise physiology and thought I would go into medical school. And so spent a couple of years working in the medical field and quickly realized that really wasn't where my personal passion was. And I had the opportunity also to travel out west. I grew up in North Carolina on the East Coast in the United States, and decided I wanted to go see the rest of the country because I'd never been west of the Mississippi River, and hopped in my van with my dog and traveled out west and spent about a year traveling from, the southern border of the United States all the way up to Canada and back, and really got to know the public lands, the landscape of the country, the different communities, and started to see, this rampant development that was happening that was just eating up nature, outside of cities and suburban sprawl, oil and gas development, and, the environmental detriments that come with that. And I love the outdoors. I love nature so much. And I just really felt a passion to change my career, to do something to help protect these places, but also while working with communities to build this beautiful vision, for the future that they want, and help them to develop the tools, the policies, and the funding to be able to realize that. So I went back to North Carolina and got a degree in geography and planning at Appalachian State University. My very first job after that was teaching GIS. And quite honestly, I didn't do a lot of GIS in my master's program. And the GIS that I did do was all command line. This was ARC info days in the GIS world. So this was quite a while ago. And GIS software has changed so much now. You know, a lot of things that used to take teams of experts to create, you know, you can really create out of the box now, or you know, use subscription services, or like platforms like your platform. So I think it's really come a long way since then. And yeah, so that's how I got into GIS. And I will say there's nothing like teaching something that you don't quite know a lot about to learn everything there is to know about it.
Yeah, maybe you can explain a little bit how to make GIS work for communities. So, for example, how to build a conservation strategy, what are the components, what to consider. So, yeah.
Yeah, so with a team of staff and consultants and working with other technology partners, I developed an approach to community-based conservation called green printing. And basically, you know, it's all about bringing community together. So bringing the experts, the stakeholders, the politicians, and, you know, the people living in the community together to tell us, you know, what's important about their community. What do they want to conserve? What do they want to restore? What do they not have in their community now that they would like to see, like more trails, for example, or more greenways and parks. And so it really starts with that. So building the vision, which is, you know, big whiteboards and people drawing things and putting sticky notes places. And then, you know, on the GIS side of things, then systematically we create themes out of all that information that we get from the community meetings. So things like communities want to protect water quality, they want to protect wildlife habitat, they want more parks and trails and open spaces. So those can be overarching themes. And then we work with the data experts in those communities to understand, does that data exist? If it does, where does it exist? How can we access it? And how should we model it? How should we analyze it? And then, you know, it's a process. So usually these processes take a year, 2 years sometimes. But in the end, you have a map or a series of maps that show consensus from the community around what they want to protect. And then once you know that, then you can start getting into those implementation strategies. You know, how are we going to do this? How much is it going to cost? How are we going to create or raise the funding? What types of policies might need to change to protect water quality, for example?
Yeah. So like the first step is really to create a common understanding about the problems, let's say, of a landscape, the threats, the constellations, who's where, what to achieve, and make these problems visible towards the community, so that they can basically use the map to get a joint understanding where the journey could potentially go to. But what then the next step? So how you going to implement? So maybe you have an example where you can outline it a little bit, where you discovered a problem or a goal in the beginning, and then how you get people moving in the same direction.
Yeah, I think a big part of this process too is building trust. You know, in a lot of communities, there are so many people who have never been at the table for these types of planning processes, and, you know, are somewhat invisible, you know, in these planning processes. So we did hundreds of green prints across the country in communities. And, you know, I think some of the things that stand out in some of these places is we realized that we weren't getting input from certain, you know, people within the community. And so we ended up going to the local pool or to the Friday night football game, and, setting up a table and, really meeting people where they are in the community to get their feedback on these plans.
Yeah.
And there were some cases where we went all the way through the process, had the maps, thought we had consensus, and then somebody came out of left field that, wasn't engaged in the process and just kind of blew it up. And so we didn't have to start from scratch, but there's I think trust is just so important in these processes, and building that, and inclusion, making sure we're creating a process that is as inclusive as possible.
Yeah. So what would you then recommend, for example, people living somewhere in the landscape, there's an issue, there's a goal where they need GIS tools. So is it always useful to have a GIS expert or remote sensing expert that accompanies the process? Or is there also a way for communities to work themselves into that space? So how accessible is the technology, the knowledge behind it?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've come a long way with GIS and technology so that it is more accessible to the average person. You don't have to be an expert to do certain things. But when it comes to, doing modeling, doing analysis on remote sense layers, data layers, satellite imagery, that does require expertise. So I think it all depends on what the issue is, what the challenge is, how you would use geospatial data and products in that process. But what we found through the green printing process is, because we were analyzing, in some cases, 40, 50, 60 data layers, and talking to the experts that manage those data layers and create those data layers, that having a geospatial expert was really needed through the process. And also somebody that's not just the technical person, but that can also speak about the technology in a way that the public and people who don't know what GIS is can understand it.
Yeah. And do you also have examples where people got some GIS tools into their own hands? So like park rangers, citizen science. Basically where the GIS is not only used in the planning process and facilitation process, but where the people got access to maps, to mapping tools, handhelds, devices, GIS devices. You have some
Yeah. We used a lot of field-based GIS applications so that the community could crowdsource. In the United States, for example, we created a crowdsource application where community members could go out and tell us what was, great about their park, what was wrong with their park, what they wanted in those locations. Reforestation projects around the world, getting geospatial applications into the hands of the people that manage those projects so that they can actually take geotag photos of trees after they're planted a year later to show they survived, and then hopefully 2 years later to show that they're thriving through geotag photos. And with those geotag photos and other information we can get from the apps, we can create really detailed maps that support that transparency and accountability of those reforestation projects. So I think that's something that has really changed the landscape over the last decade or so, is this proliferation of field-based application tools that help support that transparency.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. So I think when we spoke in preparation for the call, you mentioned an example of how to detect poaching.
Yes.
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that and explain how that worked.
Yeah, there are several companies. I think Africa National Parks is are using some of these field-based tools with remote sensing imagery analysis. And basically what they found is that these people who are poaching animals in the, the backcountry, they go in and they spend the night in the backcountry and they camp and they create campfires. And now we have satellite imagery, with resolutions that can actually detect those campfire rings, or at night, detect the heat from the fires. And so the rangers were able to create these algorithms that were able to detect where these campfires were located, and they can send rangers out to intersect those poachers. So that, I think, is a really great real-time story, real-time example of how we can use data and technology to help mitigate some of these problems that are happening out there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I heard of a similar example also in fenced, big parks, and so that the poacher could access basically the animals, they had to cut a hole into the fence. And they usually did it, I don't know, someone during the day when they passed by with a pickup or something like that, and then they put a tire next to it, so to mark the place so that they can find the hole in the fence during the night, so to access potentially their prey. And I also heard that this was also detected with remote sensing technologies. So
yeah, I think there's just so many use cases there, that we're just starting to tap into in the conservation and restoration world. Another example is some of these new tools and applications that have been used in other sectors like agriculture. There's a company called AgriPoint that has an app that uses the 3D technology. You can just take pictures of trees, or if you're doing agroforestry like cacao or apple trees, and it creates a digital twin of the tree. And then there's algorithms that run behind it that give you all the types of baseline statistics about that tree, but that can also detect things like disease, the health of the tree, species of the tree. So I think this combination.
And how are they doing it? So like disease, and how do they detect this?
Machine learning and AI. So they're taking pictures, doing machine learning on these photographs that can actually detect different types of disease and alert the farmers and the growers to that.
Well, that's really that's interesting, and the community then feeds new data to help train these algorithms and improve them, I guess, over time. Right.
Yeah, instead of having to go out and use a tape measure to measure, the diameter of the tree, the carbon potential for the tree, all those things. Now you can just use a smartphone, do captures, and the algorithms are working on the back end to create all that data for you.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. So, and this comes also to question. I put a little bit more to the end, but I will bring it now, is the cost and the value. So, as you mentioned in the past, MRV GIS technology has been really costly and mainly being used by experts. So with some extensive training. And this seems to change a little bit nowadays, right? So
definitely, yeah. These tools and the ability to integrate, data from your smartphone into platforms directly, and then letting the platforms themselves do the analytics and the measurements. I think that's really a game changer, and it's literally like pennies and dollars now to take a capture, with your smartphone and then upload it into some of these platforms and get this information returned. And when you think about the time and the cost that it takes to send people out into the field, this combination of these different tools and technologies can really help bring down the cost of that on the ground monitoring and stewardship. and enable people to do more, with their time, whether that's covering more territory for monitoring, whether it's doing, other things that need to be done that could scale in the conservation and restoration work that they're doing.
Yeah. Cool. So in the projects maybe where you have worked and introduced technology into the communities. So on the one hand, of course, there's the technology, but on the other hand, there's also the relationship. So yeah, how do you see that balancing? Because what I see here, for example, in the forestry space in Germany, so the traditional foresters are quite concerned about giving away data and information to the cloud, to some modern devices. So sometimes they just prefer pen and paper, which is not efficient, which is not accurate, which is not really scalable. So do you have some experience or examples dealing with this issue of trust, relationship, and introducing technology, new technology?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because there are really valid reasons, and sometimes validations to save people's lives to not share data widely.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot that needs to be, thought through when you're capturing this data. Like, how are you going to use it? Who's going to see it? How are you going to showcase it? Are there any issues, around sharing data? Endangered species is a great example. You don't want to show exactly where a certain endangered species is, because poachers and other people might go.
We had an example also on our platform where someone has put up a camera trap in an agroforestry system in Indonesia. And I think a week later, the Sumatran tiger passed by and they had a super nice video shot of that, which is like winning the lottery. But at the same time, they said, okay, but we cannot put it here onto the map, because if people know that there's one of these rare and potentially commercially super expensive species, then they might not come to the camera a second time. So
I mean, I think thinking through the back end, how you're managing the data, how you're protecting certain data fields or data types is really important, because I think it is, good to have the data, because you can, aggregate it up to a different scale where you don't know exactly where that tiger was seen, but it's watershed or something like that. But having the ability, for scientists and conservationists to know these things so that they can implement, whatever they need to implement for protections, I think is really important.
And also when you work with local communities and sometimes maybe even indigenous communities, how you balance, or maybe how you integrate local indigenous knowledge and make it inclusive, and not say, okay, we're coming here to this place, we're introducing some fancy new technology, but do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that the one thing, about this technology is it has become more ubiquitous and available, because almost everybody in the world has, smartphones or access to devices. And so, I think it's important to not go into a community with technology and in a top-down way, but to come in and have the technology, build their capacity with the technology, listen to them, what are the challenges that they're facing? How can the technology help them with those challenges? And maybe it's not just the specific thing you're doing, like monitoring trees. They do have other challenges that the technology could potentially help with. And so thinking more holistically and working with the community on how to integrate, apps and data and maps into the work that they're doing. And remotely sensed information is really important and key. It's all about capacity building, I think, and technical assistance, but working hand in hand with them and the collaboration to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we hear often in the environmental aids space, so where development agencies go to foreign countries and try to develop some programs, and analysis has shown that most of these programs fail. So, and those programs who have been successful were often those where they really listen to the local communities and ask, what do you need to have a better life? What do you need to protect your land?
I'll just say, Jane Goodall has a process that she uses with communities that's very effective, and that's what it's based on. You don't show up and say, here's what you should do.
How does that work? So this process?
It's a very inclusive process. A lot of talking and listening, and to your point, understanding what the challenges are that the community is facing, and then coming up with shared solutions for those.
Yeah. No, cool. Yeah, I just can give two little examples where these things have not happened. So where they try to introduce tomato, I think in an African state, and the local people were very skeptic. And I think it was like Dutch development aid that then introduced tomatoes because the site conditions were perfect. So they grow like hell, and they were saying, wow, have a look, the tomatoes are growing so nicely, and they were growing, getting big and red. And one night the hippos come out of the river and eat them all up.
Oh no.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of examples that shows it's really important to listen to the local communities. And it also shows, if we look onto the environmental space, so your book, we have to protect the places we love. We also find statistically that the areas which are best protected, often these are areas that are managed where their local communities, the land stewards. But despite all this, we also know that we need nature more than nature needs us.
True.
And I think this message also has arrived in the center of our societies today. But however, implementation of restoration projects, tree planting, conservation projects, there have been several drawbacks in recent months and years, and scandals. And we also see the private sector pulling back a little bit. So there are concerns. So there are some corporates who want to do something, or the private sector wants to do something, but they're not really sure which kind of projects they can trust. So basically, they're interested in implementing high quality integra projects because also their reputational risk depends on that. What do you think can be done to get more needed resources into the environmental, into the natural space?
Yeah, well, I mean, to your point about the tomatoes and the hippos, and there's other stories about that too with trees, where you can't just plant the trees and leave. In a lot of cases in communities, you have to have fencing to protect those seedlings for at least a certain amount of time. And so, I think we have to think through the whole process, right? Not just planting the tree.
Maybe can you describe what are, let's say, the required process to make like a tree planting or restoration program successful? So beyond, let's say, just planting.
Yeah, well, I think using data to strategically determine where, those trees should be planted and restoration is needed.
So which species, or depending on the soil conditions, or
yeah, all of those things, species, soil condition, the ability to or hold carbon, water. Water is really important. So looking at all of those different things, in some cases like corridors, right? For that tiger, if you had a more connected corridor.
To migrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different.
Yeah. So from a strategic point, so how to connect, let's say, existing biotopes with each other, so that species can migrate within the landscape.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And how to create a successful, restoration program. I think, what's happened in the last decade or so is or 2 decades even, these organizations, they spin up, they start doing a lot of restoration projects, they weren't thinking about data, as the cornerstone for accountability and transparency, and thinking about how are we going to report, evaluate and report on these projects, because you have to be able to tell your stories, right, around what's successful, what's not successful. That'll help you, pivot where you need to pivot and change your processes. But what I find is that a lot of organizations still don't have a great data infrastructure, so that you have the baselines that you can then year over year, or whatever, however time sequence you're going to be doing your monitoring, go back and see, we planted trees, or we restored this wetland, or we conserved this land. How is it doing?
Yeah. And let's say, what's the fundamental information or data you need, so because you can become super granular and scientific about it, but so let's say I want to plant 1,000 hectares of trees, native tree species, adjacent to a national park somewhere, I don't know, in the Midwest of the US. And so what kind of information, let's say, you as a manager need on the one hand, but what kind of information you need to report to a funder, so that they feel comfortable, and maybe after 3, 4, 5 years give you another 5 million to repeat it.
Yeah, so the managers really need that scientific baseline data. The funder will never care about, honestly. But the manager needs that to do their job and to understand, if there's any issues, so that they can do adaptive management as needed. So, for example, maybe an invasive species comes into that area, starts taking over. Maybe there is a disease that the tree, that affects the trees. So what are they going to do about that? So yeah, the manager needs a certain set of data and a certain set of tools. And then what you report out to the donor, a lot of corporations and donors, they care about the multitude of benefits that these projects bring, not just carbon, for example.
Like the number of carbon credits, number of trees. So they want to get the holistic picture of it.
Exactly. Biodiversity, economics, how is this project affecting the local community, all of those things. And, and also I found a lot of corporations, they want information. They don't just want data, they want pictures, they want videos, they want stories, so that they can share that with their stakeholders. And foundations want that too.
Yeah. So you would also agree that we should go a little bit beyond just tree counting. So we have the OneT.org promoted by Salesforce, where it's really about planting trees and counting these trees as a central measure. But I think if we go a little bit deeper into the ecosystem requirements, so if we compare a mangrove restoration program with a, let's say, open forest in the Sahel zone. So these are total different ecosystems, and one ecosystem might require 10,000 seedlings per hectare, and the
Right.
other ecosystem is already full when it has like 100 to 200 trees per hectare established. So, and I think the same is a little bit true with carbon credits. So you have different ecosystems. We have 1 metric ton of carbon equivalent, but in each system, they represent something totally different. So in one, it could be a eucalyptus plantation in Paraguay. In the other case, it could be a boreal forest, a mangrove restoration program, or a diverse tropical forest. So it
Right. And they all provide, environmental benefits, but also very different community benefits,
yeah,
and how do you measure those things against each other? Do they need to be measured against each other?
yeah.
You know,
Can we do it? Can we
yes.
really? Can we measure the beauty of the environment? Is this possible? I don't know.
That's a good question. I mean, I love some of the new analyses coming out of like planets. Upstream Tech has a lens product. These are remote sensing satellite companies. Restore has an algorithm they've been using to detect individual trees and then tree
Yeah,
canopy. And so I love all these new tools and algorithms that are coming out that provide these rich visuals for us to tell those stories. But I
yeah,
think you make a really good point. How do we measure not only these metrics, which are in a lot of cases very scientific, but how
yeah,
do we measure the beauty
yeah,
of these places?
yeah. Yeah, so but yeah, so as we discussed, this failed tree planting programs, failed carbon projects. So the baseline is really the data. I think that's really necessary, and we have to improve and further develop tools like, as you mentioned, I think the biomass layer that has now been published by Planet, for example.
Yeah.
But then we also have to find a way to communicate the intrinsic values of ecosystems and connect them with data. No? And
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just been really challenging for groups and countries and organizations to agree upon standards for measuring ecosystem services. But nature, I saw a statistic this week. I think it was like 30% of our carbon reductions can be met through restoration projects
yeah,
globally by 2030. So, tremendous value there. But yeah, I think that we've just really struggled to land on the right frameworks and standards for measuring ecosystem services of nature-based solutions.
yeah. Maybe as ecosystems are super diverse, maybe there will also a bunch of flowers of different tools that need to be applied. And I think we're still at the beginning to better understand it and what tools we can use, and basically grasp the stories. So I think the stories could connect these data fields.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think these global frameworks, the biodiversity framework, the SDGs, we need those, but we also need to, I think this is where that capacity building technical assistance comes into play, build from the ground up so that they meet, because to your point, every place is unique, it's different, and as the climate changes, these places are going to change as well. Species are going to change,
Yeah.
that we're already seeing them migrate. So
Yeah, so I always like a little bit the analogy. So in a commercial world, so you can substitute things just by moving money around. You can substitute, I don't know, a metal window with a plastic window and give it the same price tag. but this is something you can't do in the living ecosystem. So you cannot destroy something on one end of the world and substitute it with something on the other side of the world. And I have some some tough questions for you here. So how can nature become resilient while economies are growing and extracting natural resources?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I personally, in the last couple of years, have seen corporations really changing the way they're operating. They're listening to their consumers. People are more aware than ever now about what's happening in our world and what's happening to nature, and they want to change that. And so, they're asking corporations and companies, how are you contributing to this climate crisis, and what are you doing about it? Like, show us. And so I've really seen a shift in a lot of companies, some of the biggest companies, suppliers, on how they're thinking about not destroying places in their value chain, but helping communities to change the way they source products, the way they grow things to create products. So just a lot of change is happening in that world.
Yeah.
And I think that, countries or governments are going to be drivers, but I think corporations and we, the people, are also going to be probably even the most major driver in that change for sourcing natural resources for the products that we use. And like blockchain and some of these other newer technologies are allowing better traceability. You can actually scan some products and see, take it all the way back to the sources that were used to create those products. So I think the more transparency and visibility we get into that, which goes back to data, right?
Yeah.
They have the right systems to be able to gather that type of data. But it has been very, for me, nice to see these companies stepping up in this way.
Yeah. Yeah. So still I have my doubts if this is not still a contradiction, seeing the economy still growing. Every iPhone needs some resources to be built, so there's some kind of recycling in place. Yeah, and on the other side, I see the heavy depletion and exploitation of nature. I think that was also your initial motivation to really get into the space to protect the places you love, so to say. Yeah.
No, I am worried about it too, and the fact that our populations continue to rise, development continues rampant. It's very challenging. But this is also where, I think our geospatial tools can come into play to help us do the best job possible, knowing that we're continuing to grow.
Yeah.
But I don't have a great answer, and I do share your concerns.
I think if one has had one, then I think we have been a little bit far ahead. So we see a lot of moonshots.
Yes.
So people trying to do some exceptional things, trying to go to Mars, to invent AI, but yeah, I'm still a little bit skeptical if we can solve the very practical problems of getting back in balance with nature. So that's it. Yeah. So you already mentioned that maps could potentially play a role. I think there will be policy, there will be storytelling, but maybe we can, maybe as we finalize this discussion today, go back to the character of a map itself, so the evolution of a map. If we look, let's say, a few centuries back, or even thousands of years back, so the character of maps has really changed over time. So in the beginning, we discussed it. There were just some paintings in caves. Then maps have been drawn on parchment, paper, and quite recently they have become digital. With a raster and vector data, you have 3D information, and now we see more and more using maps or prediction of the real world in the virtual reality. So that's like the medium, how it has changed, but also the way of how maps have been used have changed. So in the beginning, let's say before of having explored the entire world, they have been used in exploration and documenting new land, but also defining countries, borders, treasure hunts. There have been a lot of wars about land ownership. That's quite good documented in maps. So the maps have been used to separate the world, to define the world. So and in more recent times, maps have been used to understand the world. So like weather, ecosystem, demography, and also measuring our own impact. So do you have any ideas what could come next? What could be the evolution of the map, or the importance or the role of maps maybe in the coming century?
And you're right. I mean, maps have been very divisive. They have been used, to conquer continents, displace people. They've been used in very hurtful and terrible ways. And they've also been used in very unionizing ways, bringing people together. And I've seen this over and over in my career where, everybody, you walk into a room, to a public meeting, and everybody's got their own thoughts, their own vision in their mind about what they want their community to look like. But it's not until you lay a map out on the table and everybody comes around and they're looking at the shared canvas, if you will, and then they start, seeing things that maybe they've never seen before, pointing out things that they haven't seen, or seeing the interconnectedness of things on the map. Then everybody starts to share a vision together. So it's not just what I have in my head and what you have in your head. We're starting to create. I think you use this term, which I really loved in one of our conversations, create the canvas, a canvas for the future. So I think, maps have been detrimental to a lot of places and communities, but also very, very key for creating a new, beautiful scenario for the future. Maps are obviously more digital now. We interact with maps through our phones, through the computers. I still love my paper maps. I pull them out all the time, my atlases, and I still love to use those. But there are people that have never seen an atlas, I'm sure now, because they're mainly focusing on maps on their phones. So, the data and the way we share it and display it has become very digital. And, we are in a digital transformation. There are still a lot of organizations, agencies, local, agencies, towns, cities, counties, even countries that aren't digitizing their data. And that's going to be really important. I think we're going to have to really start to see a shift towards more digital data and information, and also a shift in the way we're presenting that information. So to your point earlier, it's always in the United States, when you create a base map, you have, city boundaries, county boundaries, state boundaries. There are all these boundaries. And not like indigenous cultures, they don't see the landscape that way. And so,
how do they see landscapes?
One of my friends did some mapping work in the Four Corners around the Bears Ears National Monument here in the United States. And showed up with that base map with all those boundaries on it. And I think there were maybe 5 or 6 of the Native American tribes that were there, indigenous tribes. And they were like, we don't see the four corner boundaries. We don't see these boundaries. We see landforms. We see, you know, the landscape as spiritual even. And so they went back to the drawing board and created a base map that really reflected how those indigenous communities see that land. And I wrote about that in my book. I feel like it's just such a great story. And as whether you're a GIS or expert or a cartographer or a planner or, you know, a restoration expert.
How does that map looks different than, let's say, a landscape map, how we would usually experience it?
It's very topographic, you know, very much related to the landforms. Those are the things that really stand out, not any kind of lines overlaid on the map.
Yeah.
And place names, you know, are not, you know, the place names that are on the USGS maps. They're the place names that the indigenous people know those landforms to be.
Yeah. So also their own stories linked to this landscape, I guess.
Their own stories. Yeah. So they really feel a connection, not when they look at the map, they feel a connection to their landscape. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's maybe a good end of our conversation for today. How do stories connect to maps, and how maps could influence future stories?
Canvas of the future.
Canvas of the future. So I'm looking here because we having a live stream today. So I'm looking here into the chat to see if there are some questions. So maybe we have time for another 2 questions. So I think there are no questions I see here. Yeah, so then let's end it today. If you want to learn more about the work of Breece, there's a very nice website, breecerobertson.com. Maybe we can write it in the chat also. And yeah, I just want to end to say thank you very much. The world needs more people like you, I think, passionate about people and nature.
Thank you so much. And it's so great to be on the podcast today, and looking forward to continuing our work.
Yeah.
To protect the places we love.
Right. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.